In order to understand how the United States grew from a nation of farmers into an economic powerhouse, we need to start with the agrarian ideals of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. You know, where the soil was rich, the climate was warm, and there was easy access to international shipping lanes. So despite the fact that George Washington ultimately agreed with Hamilton and created the Bank of the United States in 1791, both he and everyone else understood that this was not a perfect solution. However, this arrangement didn't last long because in 1796, John Adams defeated Jefferson in the election, and Jefferson then spent the next 8 years writing angry letters from his farm about how terrible the Federalist policies were. See, while Washington was willing to follow Hamilton's lead on economic matters, he wanted to keep politics as free from financial entanglements as possible. The best way to recoup their investment, they figured, was to make the colonies into a captive market for British manufactured goods. Meanwhile, the Fourth Act, known as the Sedition Act, made it illegal to publish criticism of the government. Now, obviously, these acts were extremely controversial, and the opposition led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison fought hard against them. They published a series of essays known as the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions, arguing that the acts were unconstitutional. In response, President John Adams took a series of actions designed to strengthen the Navy and promote American shipping. Ultimately, the quasi-war ended in an undeclared truce, but the conflict had a number of lasting effects on the United States. On the one hand, there was the First Coalition, which consisted of Britain, the Netherlands, Austria, and a couple of German states. On the other hand, there was the Second Coalition, which consisted of France, Spain, and Sweden. France had acquired the territory in 1762 during the 7 Years' War, but they had never effectively controlled it. So in 1803, they sold it to the United States for $15 million, which amounted to about 3 cents per acre. First of all, the war helped to shift American public opinion away from the French and towards the British. The most important of these innovations was the steamboat, which was invented by Robert Fulton in 1807. Another innovation that helped to connect the eastern and western regions of the country was the telegraph. The telegraph was invented by Samuel Morse in 1837, and it allowed for near instantaneous communication over long distances. The upshot was that the United States was becoming increasingly integrated into a global economy. And nowhere was this more evident than in the booming port city of New Orleans. The steamboat allowed for much faster and more efficient travel on rivers and canals, which greatly reduced the time it took to transport goods and people. In fact, by the 1850s, New Orleans was the largest port city in the United States and one of the most important ports in the Western Hemisphere. If you want even more help, click right over here and grab a view packet. There are short and long-term view packets available, and they're great review tools for midterm exams, AP exams, and even the dreaded GRE. This innovation had a profound impact on the way that people and businesses operated in the United States. For example, farmers in the West were now able to get up-to-date information on market prices in the East, which allowed them to make more informed decisions about when to sell their crops. Meanwhile, the members of the Second Coalition were fighting to expand the power of France and its allies. However, the addition of all this new land did not come without its problems. As it turned out, the First Coalition won, and one of the spoils of war was the Louisiana Territory. Secondly, the war contributed to the decline of the Federalist Party, which was seen as being opposed to the expansion of the Navy. Finally, the war helped to pave the way for the Louisiana Purchase, which would double the size of the United States. However, it also posed a number of challenges. For example, President Thomas Jefferson had to decide what to do with all of this new land. Should it be admitted to the Union as a state? Should it be divided into smaller territories? Or should it simply be left as it was? Ultimately, Jefferson decided to do a little bit of everything. For example, in 1800, Congress passed the Naval Act, which authorized the construction of a number of new ships and the appropriation of funds for their maintenance. Additionally, Adams appointed a number of loyalists, people who remained loyal to the crown during the American Revolution, to key positions in the Navy in order to ensure its effectiveness. And it was those fears that led to the passage of the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts, but they did serve as a preview for the bitter, partisan battles that would come to define American politics in the following decades. You see, ever since the French Revolution, the U.S. had maintained a policy of neutrality, but that became increasingly difficult after the XYZ affair of 1797. During the XYZ affair, a group of French agents demanded a bribe from American diplomats in exchange for favorable treatment in trade negotiations. The resulting outrage led to undeclared naval warfare between the United States and France, known as the Quasi-War. But that wasn't exactly what John Adams wanted. He saw the French Revolution descending into chaos and bloodshed, and he feared that those same forces would soon be knocking on America's door. So he decided to take action. Now, these acts were essentially a series of laws designed to make it more difficult for immigrants to become citizens and to suppress anti-government publications. The purpose, to limit the influence of foreign ideas on American politics, particularly those coming from France. First of all, just check out this chart. We call this the Alien and Sedition Crisis. It shows how the number of immigrants entering the United States drastically increased during the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams. And that's important because, remember, immigrants are often drawn to the United States because of the promise of economic opportunity. But even he knew that this kind of agricultural abundance could not sustain the growth of a nation. In fact, in many ways, the story of the United States began with these two guys. Okay, maybe not literally, but they do own a pair of those big white teeth. But in the late 18th century, most Americans were still farmers, and the country was dominated by an elite class of planters and merchants. Because when it came to the future of American industry, no one had bigger dreams than this guy. Like Hamilton recognized that most of the agricultural production in the U.S. occurred in the South, which relied heavily on slave labor. And he feared that if the nation's economy continued to be primarily agricultural, it would be at the mercy of powerful European nations. So while Jefferson dreamed of an America full of independent farmers, he also realized that his country needed industrial workers and merchants in order to grow. In fact, the British still held a considerable amount of debt from the Revolutionary War, and they were looking to collect on it. Now remember that all of this happened before the United States had fully developed a political party system. And so he appointed Hamilton as political rivals to key positions in the new bank in hopes that having them in close proximity to the source of financial power would entice them to work toward a compromise. But the presidency of John Adams proved to be quite contentious. However, the rapid increase in immigration led to growing anxieties about the influence of foreign affairs on American politics. You see, by 1798, the French Revolution had been raging for over 10 years, and its ideals of liberty and equality were proving quite infectious among American intellectuals. The first three of the four acts placed restrictions on immigration and made it harder for immigrants to become citizens. Ultimately, the Alien and Sedition Acts failed to prevent the rise of the Democratic-Republican Party. Now, the other major point of contention during John Adams' presidency was the Quasi-War with France. The conflict lasted from 1798 to 1800 and resulted in a number of American ships being captured by the French. All of this was very expensive, and it proved to be quite unpopular with the American public, who felt that the government was overstepping its bounds by funding a navy at all. You see, the conflict between France and America was part of a larger struggle between two competing European coalitions. Now, the members of the First Coalition were fighting to restore the balance of power in Europe that had existed prior to the French Revolution. The territory encompassed roughly 828,000 square miles, and included parts of the modern-day United States from Florida to the Canadian border and from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. Now, this was an incredible deal for the United States, and it effectively doubled the size of the country. Over the next several decades, the Louisiana Territory was divided into 15 separate states. But that problem was about to change because in the early 19th century, several technological innovations made it possible to travel more quickly and efficiently across vast distances. In fact, by 1830, steamboats were being used to transport passengers from New York to New Orleans in as little as 20 days. In fact, the first telegraph line connected Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, and it was able to transmit messages in less than a minute. In turn, merchants in the East were able to get up-to-date information on the availability of goods in the West, which allowed them to expand their businesses. New Orleans had long been an important port city, but the addition of the steamboats and the telegraph really helped to solidify its position. So I hope that helped you understand how America went from a nation of farmers to an economic powerhouse in such a short period of time. The U.S. goes global. Imperial America and overseas aspirations. Late 19th, early 20th century. Americas across oceans. In this video, we're going to look at how the United States went from a relatively isolated nation in the Western Hemisphere to a full-fledged imperial power with interests across the globe. This conflict, which arose out of the long-standing struggle between Spain and the Cubans for independence, was a brief but intense engagement that had significant consequences. One notable approach was that of Theodore Roosevelt, who advocated for a strong military and a forceful foreign policy. Roosevelt's approach to diplomacy, often referred to as the Big Stick approach, was exemplified by his actions in constructing the Panama Canal Zone. Before the war, the United States had largely pursued a policy of non-intervention, focusing primarily on its own internal affairs and avoiding entanglements with European powers. One such instance was the occupation of Veracruz, Mexico in 1914. This event occurred in the midst of the Mexican Revolution, a complex and multifaceted struggle that aimed to overthrow the long-standing dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz and address various social and economic issues in the country. However, the revolution soon descended into chaos and violence, leading to instability and concerns among U.S. officials about the safety of American citizens and businesses in Mexico. Tensions escalated when a group of armed Mexicans attacked and killed several U.S. citizens in the port city of Veracruz. In response, President Woodrow Wilson ordered the U.S. Navy to occupy the city. This action was seen as a way to protect American interests and ensure the safety of U.S. citizens in Mexico. However, the occupation was widely seen as an example of American imperialism and raised concerns about U.S. intentions in Mexico. Ultimately, the occupation lasted for several months and resulted in strained diplomatic relations between the United States and Mexico. However, the outbreak of World War I and the subsequent stalemate between the warring factions led to a gradual shift in American public opinion. U.S. effort to exert control over the Western Hemisphere and ensure stability in the region. At the time, Haiti was struggling with political instability and economic difficulties, which made it vulnerable to outside influence. The United States, along with several European powers, intervened in Haitian affairs, and U.S. Marines occupied the country. This intervention was justified on the grounds that it was necessary to protect American lives and property in Haiti. However, it was widely seen as an example of American imperialism and neo-colonialism in the region. The U.S. occupation of Haiti lasted for 19 years, during which time the United States exerted significant control over the country's government and economy. This intervention had a significant impact on Haiti, setting back its development and contributing to ongoing instability in the country. Initially, there was considerable support for neutrality, as many Americans saw the conflict as one between European powers that did not involve the United States. However, As the war dragged on and the casualties mounted, the debate over neutrality intensified. Ultimately, a combination of factors including economic interests, diplomatic tensions, and humanitarian concerns led to the United States entering the war in 1917. The American entry into the conflict tipped the balance of power in favor of the Allied forces and contributed to the eventual victory. In fact, American participation in the war had a profound impact on the outcome, providing the much-needed manpower and resources that helped to secure victory for the Allies. Following the war, the United States emerged as a major player on the world stage, assuming a position of power and influence that had previously been held by European nations. This new status was reflected in the country's increased involvement in international affairs, including its participation in the Paris Peace Conference and the establishment of the League of Nations. Moreover, the war had a profound impact on the American economy, which had grown significantly during the conflict due to increased industrial production and trade with allied nations. This economic growth contributed to the rise of the United States as a global power and helped to shape its role in the post-war world. Overall, World War I marked a turning point in American history, transforming the country from an isolated and relatively unknown entity on the world stage to a major player with far-reaching interests and influence across the globe. The war had a profound impact on the country's economy, politics, and society, shaping it into the global power it is today. By using the U.S. Navy to protect American interests and enforce its will, the U.S. established a strategic waterway that connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Similarly, when Colombia refused to allow the U.S. to build a canal across their territory, Roosevelt took a more aggressive stance, supporting a Panamanian revolution and using the U.S. military to occupy the newly formed country. This interventionist policy extended beyond the Western Hemisphere, with Roosevelt sending the U.S. Navy to East Asia in 1905 to force Japan to end its unfair restrictions on trade with the United States. These actions demonstrated the emerging theme of American exceptionalism, which held that the United States had a unique mission to bring democracy and capitalism to other parts of the world. However, as we shall see, this ideology also masked a darker aspect of American imperialism, namely, the tendency to use superior military force to dominate other nations. It resulted in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines becoming overseas territories of the United States. Wilson's moral diplomacy was evident in his decision to intervene in Mexico following the Mexican Revolution. Despite public opposition to intervention in Mexico, Wilson felt compelled to restore order and stability in the region. He sent U.S. troops to Veracruz and launched a military campaign into Mexico. However, the U.S. involvement ultimately proved to be unsuccessful in achieving its goals, and Wilson was forced to withdraw American forces from Mexico in 1914. Despite this setback, Wilson's commitment to promoting democracy abroad remained steadfast, and he continued to advocate for greater U.S. involvement in world affairs. This perspective was particularly evident in Wilson's decision to enter World War I in 1917. Wilson's stated reason for entering the war was to make the world safe for democracy. And in 1918, he articulated 4 key principles that should guide the peace negotiations at the end of the war. These principles included open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, free trade, and self-determination for nations. With the entry of the United States into the war, the conflict quickly came to an end, and the victorious Allied powers met at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 to discuss the terms of peace. However, Wilson's vision for the post-war world was challenged by the other Allied powers, who were primarily interested in punishing Germany for its role in the conflict. As a result, the Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh reparations on Germany and placed strict limitations on its military capabilities. Wilson, on the other hand, argued against punitive measures and instead advocated for a more lenient approach that would promote lasting peace. Despite his efforts, the treaty as it stood was rejected by the U.S. Senate, and the United States never joined the League of Nations, which was established to prevent future wars. Nevertheless, the end of World War I marked a significant moment in American history as the United States emerged as a world power with interests and influence across the globe. As the U.S. acquired these territories, the question arose as to how it would administer them. Most people expected the Philippines to be the main focus of American efforts because it was the most substantial territorial acquisition since the Louisiana Purchase. However, it was the smallest of the three territories in terms of population and geographic size. Instead, the majority of U.S. resources were allocated to the administration of Puerto Rico and Cuba. Additionally, despite some early calls for annexation, only Cuba was ruled to be permanently under American control. The reasons for this decision are complex and varied. For example, many Americans felt that annexing the Filipinos would not be feasible due to their unfamiliar culture and religion. Furthermore, such an action would have been perceived as hypocritical given the simultaneous promotion of Cuban independence. Ultimately, the U.S. opted to grant limited self-rule to both Puerto Rico and the Philippines, while maintaining ultimate authority over these territories. Although the extent of Filipino autonomy was greater than that of Puerto Rico, the latter was granted more favorable economic conditions. Both island groups were caught in a colonial situation akin to that of the U.S.'s earlier period as a British colony. While formal annexation was avoided, the U.S. still exerted economic, military, and political influence over these areas. In essence, the Spanish-American War led to a significant shift in American foreign policy, marking a departure from its previous isolationist stance and setting the stage for further overseas involvement. Okay, before we dive into this topic, I need to explain this here. Alright, so let's get started. Now let us begin with the big event that catapulted the United States onto the world stage, the Spanish-American War. Now, as the U.S. became more engaged in world affairs, a variety of perspectives emerged regarding how the nation should wield its growing power. Another perspective on foreign policy emerged under Woodrow Wilson, who believed that the United States should use its power to promote democracy and spread American values. Okay, now let's talk about how the U.S. involvement in World War I transformed the country from an isolated and insular nation into a major player on the world stage. Now let's get to some examples of how the U.S. asserted its growing influence around the world in the period following World War I. Another example of U.S. assertiveness during this period was the intervention in Haiti in 1915. This intervention was part of a larger. First, the United States helped Great Britain prepare for the war by passing the Lend-Lease Act, which provided military assistance to our allies. And secondly, the United States trained and prepared for its own entry into the war, which came when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union and pushed D-Day back to May of 1941. And at first, it seemed to work. But then Hitler decided to annex all of Czechoslovakia and then Poland. And that led to Britain and France finally declaring war on Germany. And as a result, America could no longer remain uninvolved in world affairs. And although it appealed to many Europeans who felt lost in the economic and political turmoil of the early 20th century, it also alarmed Americans who recognized fascism for what it was, a 20th century version of the Axis powers that had started World War I. First of all, although the United States did not join the League of Nations, the rest of the world was still closely connected to the U.S. in important ways. Economically speaking, the Great Depression had worldwide effects, and the U.S. played a major role in trying to fix it. Secondly, the rise of fascism in Europe and Asia created significant tension, and the U.S. responded to that tension with appeasement. And thirdly, World War II eventually engulfed the entire planet, and the U.S. was forced to play a major role in that conflict. In particular, Americans feared the aggressive foreign policies of fascist Italy under Mussolini, fascist Germany under Hitler, and militaristic Japan under the military clique. And although these three powers would eventually form the Axis powers and fight against the United States, at this point, Americans were still trying to avoid another conflict in Europe. Now, if you recall in the last video at the end of World War I, President Woodrow Wilson wanted the United States to join the League of Nations, which was basically a group of European nations that would work together to ensure lasting peace. After the war, Europeans were rebuilding their economies, and Americans had a lot to sell them. So trade flourished during this period, and that economic connection between the U.S. and the rest of the world would only grow. When the stock market crashed in 1929 and ushered in the Great Depression. And as bad as things were in the United States, things were much worse in Europe, which led to the following. First of all, Europeans needed loans from the U.S. to help their economies recover. And that led to the growth of financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, whose purpose was to help stabilize currencies around the world. Secondly, Americans set up the World Bank to help finance the rebuilding of Europe after the war. And thirdly, the dollar became the chief currency of international diplomacy. And that last part is what historians call dollar diplomacy. Basically, the United States wielded tremendous economic power on the world stage, and that made it difficult for the country to remain truly isolated. One was that Americans had been fighting in Europe for 4 years, and by the time it was over, they were kind of done with it. And even before the war was over, American isolationists began urging President Wilson not to join the League of Nations. And those isolationists had some powerful allies in Congress, where the president did not have enough support to get the U.S. into the League. Therefore, the U.S. did not join. But here's the thing. Even though the U.S. didn't join the League of Nations, the rest of the world was still connected to the United States in other ways. So let's begin our consideration of that connection with the economy. However, the largest reason the U.S. could not escape world affairs in this period was fascism. So fascism was a new kind of intense nationalism that had emerged in Europe during the interwar period. And so the United States responded to the rise of fascism with a policy known as appeasement. So the final reason that the United States could not escape world affairs in this period was World War II itself. Consider this. You're standing at the foot of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, looking up at the Iron Giant as it slowly fades into the twilight. It's 1951, and across town in a luxurious apartment, a handsome American GI is sipping on a Coca-Cola, watching a Hollywood movie on his black and white TV, waiting for his date to arrive. And on the other side, you had the Soviet Union, a communist autocracy which banned most forms of foreign cultural influence. Both were former allies. But their relationship quickly soured as Soviet leader Joseph Stalin began to assert control over Eastern Europe. As tensions rose, several European countries formed an alliance for mutual defense in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. We can see this especially clearly in the way each side viewed and interacted with the rest of the world. Overall, neither superpower respected the agency or autonomy of the countries it considered within its sphere of influence. After World War II, the U.S. emerged as the dominant force in global affairs. They touted their achievements in science and technology, such as launching the first satellite and sending the first human into space, as proof of the superiority of the communist system. And in 1961, President John F. Kennedy challenged the nation to commit itself to sending humans to the moon before the end of the decade. It played out in so many different arenas, from the military to the political, to the cultural to the scientific, that it's impossible to separate it from the rest of the world. It was a conflict that defied easy categorization, a struggle between two superpowers that was fought not just on battlefields, but in boardrooms, living rooms, and laboratories. It was a clash of ideologies that permeated every aspect of daily life. shaping everything from the clothes we wore to the music we listened to, the food we ate, and the cars we drove. The space race was on, and the results were astonishing. Between the 1960s and 1970s, American and Soviet scientists made incredible discoveries and innovations in medicine, engineering, physics, and materials science. GM even developed the Wankel engine, an innovative new type of engine that promised to revolutionize transportation. But then the government pulled funding for it, leaving the company to abandon the project. One of the greatest examples of American ingenuity, the Wankel engine was quietly shelved, becoming yet another casualty of the Cold War arms race. They claimed that their state-directed approach to innovation was more efficient and could outpace the capitalist United States in the long run. Of course, this wasn't entirely true, as the U.S. went on to land astronauts on the moon a few years later. But still, the Soviets made significant advances in science and technology, especially in the early years of the space race. This was partly due to the fact that their scientists were freed from the constraints of commercialization. The Soviet government funded research projects based on their potential military or strategic value rather than their profitability. So they were able to make rapid progress in developing new technologies without having to worry about whether or not they would turn a profit. Its military and economic strength was unmatched, and it used this power to shape international institutions in its mold. In fact, the very foundation of the modern global economy was laid down by American leaders who created the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, setting the rules for international trade. But these organizations weren't just meant to serve as instruments of statecraft. They also reflected America's core values, emphasizing cooperation, free markets, and open trade. Simultaneously, the U.S. projected its culture abroad through Hollywood movies, jazz music, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and blue jeans, symbols of American freedom and prosperity. It was a subtle form of diplomacy, but no less effective for its subtlety. And by the 1960s, these symbols of American culture were so popular around the world that it led to a backlash. From the British band The Beatles to French philosopher Jean Baudrillard, intellectuals and artists began to critique American cultural imperialism, arguing that it was a form of neo-colonialism designed to control the minds of consumers in the developing world. Rather, both Washington and Moscow saw the world through a myopic lens, believing that they alone had the right vision for the future of humanity, and that all other nations must either join them or be contained. This attitude would lead to proxy conflicts around the world, resulting in the deaths of millions of innocent people. The Americans sought to build a web of alliances throughout the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, fostering economic development as a bulwark against the spread of communism. At the same time, the Soviet Union pursued a policy of national self-determination, supporting independence movements in colonies around the world as a way to sow discord among potential U.S. allies. Each side attempted to win over neutral nations, drawing them into their respective camps. For example, Indonesia joined the non-aligned movement in the 1950s, seeking to maintain good relations with both superpowers while pursuing its own interests. The U.S. feared that a neutral Indonesia might fall under the sway of communism, so it secretly plotted to overthrow its government. But when the CIA-backed coup failed, the U.S. abruptly ended diplomatic relations with the country, cutting off much-needed foreign aid and investment. Similarly, the Soviets offered support to anti-colonial movements in Africa and Asia as a way to undermine American influence, seeing decolonization as a path to spreading communism. However, once these areas became socialist states aligned with the Soviet Union, Moscow often turned on them. They saw newly independent nations as potential allies, not as equal partners. 2 years later, the Soviets responded by forming their own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. Now both sides had solidified their positions in Europe and the rest of the world. This alarmed President Harry Truman, who believed it was the US's responsibility to contain the spread of communism. He established the Truman Doctrine in 1947, committing $400 million to support any nation resisting communist pressure. Congress passed the Marshall Plan, offering billions of dollars in aid to rebuild Western European economies, which had been devastated during the war. These two programs marked the beginning of the Cold War, a sustained state of hostility and competition between two superpowers and their respective alliances, and imprisoned or executed anyone who tried to bring it in. And despite how different these two societies seemed, they had one thing in common: a mutual desire to remake the world in their own image. But those things are reserved only for decadent Western wokomano. This soldier is part of the Soviet Union, a totalitarian state that values obedience and conformity over individual freedoms like expression, religion, and movement. In fact, there are so many differences between the two sides that some historians have called this period the long 1960s, because it was a decade where cultures diverged dramatically. She's getting ready just a few blocks away, putting on a crisp new dress from an American. Brand doing her makeup with American cosmetics fixing, her hair with an American hairbrush, and soon she'll be stepping out into the night in a pair of high-heeled American shoes. And when they meet up, they likely go dancing in an American-style discotheque to an American tune playing on an American jukebox. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, a Russian soldier stands by the Berlin Wall looking longingly at the skyscrapers of West Berlin. On one side, you had the United States of America, a democratic superpower whose military, in this series, we've already covered how the United States became the world's first superpower after World War II, establishing the foundations for what would become the free market capitalist world order. But in the decades following the war, the U.S. faced increasing challenges from the Soviet Union and its allies, leading to a global confrontation between two radically different visions for society. This is the Cold War, and it will be the longest, strangest, and perhaps most consequential conflict in human history. The rivalry between the U.S. and USSR began almost immediately after the end of World War II, and while it never escalated into direct large-scale military conflict, it would indirectly result in millions of deaths through proxy conflicts like Korea and Vietnam. This division would not only shape international politics for the next 4 decades, but also have a profound impact on culture and daily life. This was nowhere more evident than in the Congo, where the Soviets backed a communist-aligned dictator, Mobutu Sese Seko, who ruled with an iron fist, crushing opposition and stealing billions of dollars from his people. But beyond the military, the Cold War was also fought in the realm of ideas and culture. At the same time, the Soviet Union was doing the exact same thing. By the 1960s, the rivalry had reached a fever pitch. And this is why, ultimately, the Cold War was such a strange conflict. Now, if you want to learn more about the ways the Cold War affected daily life, stay tuned for our upcoming videos on technology, fashion, food, and music in the era of atomic anxiety. All right, Unit 5, the unipolar moment and post-Cold War era, 1991 to 2001. If you remember at the end of Unit 4, the Cold War is over. The Soviet Union has collapsed, and there is one superpower left standing, and it is the United States. That means growing interdependence among nations due to the increasing flow of goods, services, capital, labor, and information across borders. Now that might sound kind of vague and abstract, but really what this means is like imagine we living in a small village, right? And then eventually your village becomes a town, and then it becomes a city, and then eventually you've got people from all over the world living together in the same place, and they re-interacting with each other on a daily basis. So throughout this period, the U.S. is going to get involved in several ethnic conflicts around the world. You've got 3 ethnic groups living together in Bosnia: the Bosnian Serbs, the Croats, and the Muslims. Well, the Serbs decide that they want to create a greater Serbia, and they start attacking the other ethnic groups and doing terrible things. It is intervening in these conflicts to promote peace and stability and human rights. It's an extension of the Monroe Doctrine. Remember that? So this leads us to our final term, NATO. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And what this is an alliance between the United States, Canada, and most of the countries of Western Europe. They all met together in an alliance to oppose the spread of communism. That's what NATO was originally created for. But after the Cold War, NATO transitions into something else. It becomes a peacekeeping organization. And so now NATO is going to take on these various ethnic conflicts with the U.S. They bombed the Serbs in Bosnia and Kosovo, for example. The U.S. is going to intervene in conflicts in our own hemisphere to promote peace and stability. Well, now we're taking that global. There's growing globalization. You've got the U.S. intervening in ethnic conflicts around the world. And all of this is done under the auspices of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this is where you get the term ethnic cleansing, which is the Serbs are trying to ethnically cleanse Bosnia by kicking out the other ethnic groups. Anyway, the UN and the US get involved to stop the Serbs. They bomb Serbia and they help establish peace. First example you need to know is Somalia. In Somalia, the US sent troops in 1992 to try to stop a civil war between different clans or ethnic groups. The Serbs are trying to ethnically cleanse Kosovo by kicking out the Albanians. So the US gets involved, bombs the Serbs, and helps establish peace. The fighting had gotten so bad that thousands of Somali people were dying every day. So President George H.W. Bush decided to intervene. He sent in American troops to establish peace. But it was not successful. The U.S. got bogged down in the conflict, and many Americans ended up being killed. So the U.S. withdrew and handed the peacekeeping mission over to the UN. For another thing, you have international organizations like the WTO that are doing the same thing. And finally, you have technology, specifically the internet and satellites, and all kinds of things that allow for instantaneous communication across great distances. So this unit is going to be about what happens when there is only one superpower. It's called the unipolar moment. Let's get started with some big picture terms. All right, first of all, what is globalization? That is the increasing interconnectedness of the world. Now the WTO sets the rules of the global trading system. So any nation or state that wants to participate in international trade has to abide by the rules of the WTO. And these rules ensure that trade flows as smoothly as possible. There's no tariffs or quotas or anything to hinder the movement of goods. And so all of these things together, NAFTA and the WTO and the EU, they all point to this growing interconnectedness of the world economy. Now this is important because this period right after the Cold War in the 1990s especially was a time when globalization exploded. There are two big examples of this that you need to know. First of all, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which went into effect in 1994. This is a trade agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And if you remember at the end of Unit 4, we were talking about the European Union. Well, NAFTA is kind of like the North American version of that. It allows for the free flow of goods across those three national borders. All right, now let's talk about ethnic conflict. Second example, Bosnia. Here's what's happening. And then third, Kosovo. Similar situation here. War on Terror and 21st Century Realignment, 2001-2020, working title, After the Ashes. Global, Order in the Age of Terror and Transition. The 9/11 shock, catalyst of a new era. The attacks, September 11th, 2001, coordinated by Al-Qaeda, killing nearly 3,000. Immediate reaction, emergency declarations. Bush's War on Terror framing. NATO's invocation of Article 5 for the first time ever. Symbolic impact, a national trauma. The image of American vulnerability. Rise in patriotism and military support. Afghanistan. The First Front invasion, October 2001. Target: Taliban and al-Qaeda hideouts, supported by NATO and Northern Alliance. Initial success, long-term challenge. Kabul falls quickly, but Taliban remnants survive. Hamid Karzai's fragile government. NATOISAF role. Stabilization attempts. Civil-military operations. Resurgence of Taliban. Cross-border sanctuaries in Pakistan. Guerrilla warfare escalates. Iraq War, 2003 to 2011. Preemptive. Missteps build up. WMD claims never found. Axis of evil speech. Lack of UN consensus. Invasion. March 2003. Fall of Saddam Hussein. Mission accomplished. Error. Occupation and insurgency. Sectarian violence. Emergence of al-Qaeda. In Iraq, a QI. Abu Ghraib scandal damages U.S. image. The Surge, 2007. Tactical success under Gen. Petraeus. Stabilization begins, but fragile. The Homeland Shift. Security. Surveillance and Rights Department of Homeland Security, 2002. TSA. Border Security. Fusion Centers. The Patriot Act. Expanded wiretaps and surveillance. Debate over civil liberties. NSA Revelations, 2013. Edward Snowden leaks. Global reaction and erosion of trust. Islamophobia and civil rights. Rise in hate crimes. Surveillance of Muslim communities. Global ramifications. Diplomacy and blowback strained alliances. France, Germany, and public opinion on Iraq. UK's controversial involvement. Chilcot Inquiry. Middle East destabilization. Power vacuums in Iraq and Syria. Radicalization pathways. Rise of drones and proxy wars. Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan. Targeted killings. Legality and backlash. Rise of ISIS and recalibrated strategies origins. ISIS emerges from AQI, capitalizes on Syrian civil war and Iraqi chaos. 2014 to 2019 ISIS Caliphate. Controls Mosul, Raqqa. Mass executions, global recruitment. US-led coalition response. Airstrikes, special forces, Kurdish alliances. ISIS loses territory, but persists as insurgency. Terror abroad. Paris, 2015. Brussels, Istanbul, Manchester. Lone wolf attacks and global fear. Strategic rebalancing. China, Russia, and the pivot to Asia. End of U.S. unipolarity. Iraq and Afghanistan fatigue. Decline of soft power. China's rise. Economic surge. Belt and Road Initiative. South China Sea militarization. U.S. pivot to Asia under Obama. Russia's return. Georgia, 2008. Crimea, 2014. Syria. Russia challenges U.S. dominance. America's dilemma. Can't abandon. Middle East. Must face Pacific competition. Domestic shifts. Global consequences Obama years. Iraq withdrawal, 2011. Bin Laden raid, 2011. Drone strategy expansion. Trump administration. America first foreign policy. NATO skepticism. Withdrawal from Iran deal and Paris Agreement. Pullback from Syria and Afghanistan signals retreat. Domestic polarization. Capitol riot 2021. Previewed by earlier polarization. Undermines global perception of U.S. democracy. Legacy and lessons of the war on terror. Financial and human cost. $8 trillion plus spent. 900,000 plus deaths, civilian plus combatants. Moral dilemmas. Torture. Guantanamo Bay. Global loss of trust. Shifts in military doctrine. Counterinsurgency. Cyber and hybrid warfare. Permanent war state. Endless gray zone conflicts. Private contractors. CIA expansion. Conclusion. From the ashes to the unknown future, did America win? Bin Laden is dead, but terrorism has adapted. Strategic fatigue. U.S. exits Afghanistan in 2021. A new global era. Terror isn't gone, but competition with China and AI now leads. Reckoning with legacy. The war on terror remade global. Norms and questioned American leadership. Today and Beyond, 2020 Present. Working title. Unsteady Giants. America in a Fragmented World. The Pandemic Shock. 2020 to 2022. COVID-19 as Global Crisis. Origin in Wuhan. Rapid global spread. Economic shutdowns. Overwhelmed health systems. Global supply chains frozen, exposing U.S. vulnerabilities. U.S. domestic response. Initial disorganization. Mixed federal-state messages. Operation Warp Speed. Vaccine development success. Over 1 million U.S. deaths. Global vaccine politics. Vaccine diplomacy by China and Russia. Global North versus South inequality. COVAX criticism. Impact on U.S. soft power. Perceived decline in global leadership. Internal chaos versus China's early reopening. Polarization and the American political divide 2020. Election and aftermath. Biden wins with record turnout. Trump refuses to concede January 6th Capitol riot. The rise of post-truth politics. Misinformation. Kanan. Election denialism. Big tech censorship versus free speech debates. Erosion of global democratic norms. U.S. democratic model questioned abroad. Illiberal regimes point to Capitol attack as hypocrisy. Great power rivalries. Use China-Russia triad China's. Challenge. Expanding Navy. Belt and Road Initiative. BRI. TikTok soft power. Taiwan tensions. Pelosi visit. Military drills. Trade tech war. Semiconductors, Huawei, rare earths. Russia's global disruption. 2022 invasion of Ukraine. NATO revival and Western unity. U.S. sends billions in aid, new Cold War feel. Strategic realignment. AUKUS, Quad, India, U.S., Japan, Australia. Anti-China consensus. Global South's non-alignment. India, Brazil fence sit on Ukraine. BRICS emerging as alternative economic bloc. Climate crisis and technological. Transitions global climate challenge. Paris Agreement. Revival under Biden. U.S. Inflation Reduction Act 2022 and green subsidies. Wildfires, hurricanes. Climate refugees. Energy geopolitics. European rush to replace Russian gas. U.S. LNG exports increase influence. Tech wars. Race for AI supremacy. TikTok bans. ChatGPT diplomacy. Quantum computing, cyber warfare, and global norms. America's foreign policy reset. Biden doctrine. Democracy versus autocracy framing. Rebuilding NATO, G7, and Pacific alliances. Withdrawal from Afghanistan, 2021. Taliban's swift return to power. Scenes from Kabul airport. Damage credibility. Re-engagement with multilateral institutions. WHO, UN Human Rights Council, Paris Climate Accord. Challenges of balancing values and interests. Shifting global order. Rise of the multipolar. World end-of-use unipolar moment. U.S. still strongest, but no longer unquestioned. Erosion of liberal international order. Regional powers. Rise. Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia asserting regional authority. India as swing power. Economic shifts. U.S. dollar remains strong, but challenged by yuan crypto. Global South seeks de-dollarization. cultural counterflows, Korean media, African tech startups, Chinese AI catching up. America no longer sole cultural exporter. Cultural shifts, social movements, and domestic realignment. George Floyd and racial reckoning. 2020. Global Black Lives Matter protests. Police reform and backlash debates. Culture wars. Education, LGBTQ rights, gun control polarization. Woke debates, book bans, free speech conflict. Generational divide. Gen Z activism versus boomer establishment. Rising distrust of institutions. Economic resilience and inflation fears post-COVID recovery. Stimulus checks. Labor shortages, remote work revolution. Stock market highs, then tech crash 2022-23. Inflation and interest rates. Global energy prices plus supply chain plus war equals rising costs. Fed hikes rates aggressively. Recession worries. Reindustrialization trend. U.S. CHIPS Act. Clean energy boom. Made in America returns reshoring supply chains. The future. Challenges and contingencies. Democracy at crossroads. 2024 election stakes. Biden versus Trump rematch. Will U.S. democratic institutions hold? AI and automation. Job disruption, misinformation, surveillance concerns. Who sets the rules for artificial intelligence? Geopolitical flashpoints. Taiwan, Iran-Israel conflict, North Korea tests. Hopeful trends. Space innovation, NASA, SpaceX. Youth activism and global cooperation on climate. Conclusion. A world watching America. Global eyes on youth choices. Still a symbol for better or worse. Leading, but not alone. From sole superpower to first among many. From crisis to possibility. If America can address internal divides and adapt, it may still lead the world into a more stable, just future.